Everybody ready? Good afternoon and welcome to the Wilson Center. On behalf of the Environmental Change and Security Program, I want to welcome you all here to this magnificent resource for the nation, the Woodrow Wilson International Center. I welcome you for today's session, National Security and the Threat of Climate Change. I'm Sherri Boehlert, a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center. Having recently retired from Congress, I have to add, voluntarily retired in view of what happened in the last election. I served in Congress for 24 years, the last 6 of which as chairman of the House Science Committee. On the Science Committee, we were very focused on climate change issues, but often ran into roadblocks and skepticism. I'm pleased to report that skepticism still exists, but a lot less of it, and the roadblocks are still around, although fewer and farther between. Today, however, we see some real momentum for taking serious the threats of climate change. I view this as a clear example of an area where the public is ahead of the policymakers, way ahead. There are a lot of reasons for this new momentum. One reason has been new voices, in some instances, such as the IPCC report, an international chorus weighing in on how climate change is expected to have wide-ranging impacts on security. Unfortunately, there are still some people in this town who either legitimately don't get it or, despite everything, refuse to get it. And if you looked at news media reports over the last 24 to 36 hours, you'll see a Washington Post dispatch, a Reuters dispatch, a report from the BBC this morning that the U.S. is trying to block sections of a draft agreement on climate change prepared for next month's G8 summit. And one of the offensive clauses, I'm told, from BBC, we are deeply concerned about the latest findings confirmed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But I'm comforted by the fact that a spokeswoman for the White House said the U.S. continues to lead the global effort on climate change. I guess that depends on how you define effort. Well, I view our speakers as representing some of the best examples of those new voices. Not getting it doesn't apply to our distinguished panelists, and we owe them a debt of gratitude for their service. Looking at the national security implications of climate change is one way we are demonstrating the seriousness with which we are viewing climate's wide-ranging predicted impacts. I would like to introduce, to start us off, Sherri Goodman, General Counsel for the CNA Corporation. Sherri is the former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security and has been the Executive Director of the CNA process that has brought together 11 retired 3- and 4-star flag officers to write the Climate Security Report under discussion today. And there was a very interesting discussion on this report last week before the Senate. Sherri will provide, and incidentally, you don't have to be named Sherri to get on this panel. Sherri will provide some background on CNA's Military Advisory Board and introduce Generals Farrell, Kern, and Wald, as well as Mr. David from the British Embassy. I present to you Sherri Goodman.
Thank you very much, Congressman Boehlert, or Sherri, as I should say. It does help to have a Sherri. And thank you for your leadership and your bipartisan approach to these often contentious issues of science, and environment. You, I believe, have served our nation well in your years of service in the Congress, and I want to thank you. I have deep respect for your work.
Thank you very much.
And I'd like to thank Jeff DeBelco, who is the director of the Environmental Change and Security Project here. Jeff, you have grown this project with great spirit and initiative, and we've worked together for over a decade now, and you've brought this to these compelling and issues to an important place in the public policy debate. So thank you. I'm privileged today to have 3 members of our Military Advisory Board from the National Security and Climate Change Project here with us. And I will introduce these 3 gentlemen and our distinguished representative from the British Embassy, David Thomas, in just a moment. We came together on this project starting last September. 11 generals and admirals representing all branches of the military service, covering all regions of the world. I should have counted up the number of years of service of all of the 11. Perhaps we should do that, David, so we can report that. But it is many, many years of service to our nation and distinguished military leadership. And they have brought their experience to bear on this complicated and complex matter of the national security implications of climate change. We have spent about 8 months working on this effort, better to understand what are the implications of climate change for national security. And our bottom line is that climate change is a serious threat to our national security, and now is the time to take sensible actions to integrate it into national security frameworks and to build the necessary capacity and resilience to address it responsibly in the future. We have found that climate change is a threat multiplier for instability in some of the most volatile regions of the world, and we will, I know our panelists will talk with you at greater length about that today. I want to note that we have some of our team here with us today as well, and in fact, many of you I have worked with for over a decade or more now, so in some ways this is like old home week to see good friends and colleagues here in the audience. I want to note some of our colleagues who've worked with us on this project who are here today, so that you can get to meet them afterwards. I see David Katarius is here. I think Noel Gerson is here as well. Steve Hirsch, and there may be a few others. So thank you all for your help and for your efforts on this project. Now I would like first to introduce General Wald. He was, in his last assignment, the Deputy Commander of the United States European Command, which is a bit of a misnomer because in addition to Europe, he was responsible for United States military operations throughout Africa. And he has extensive experience in Africa, which he will, some of which I'm sure he will share with you as it relates to the subject of climate change. He also has a great deal of military operational and warfighting experience, having command of the 31st Fighter Wing in Aviano that was involved in the first NATO combat operations in Bosnia. And so now I would like to introduce to you General Chuck Wald.
Thank you, Sherri. Thank you. Actually, my first name is Sherri Wald. But Congressman, thank you very much. They offered us a script to talk about what we should talk about, and I'm not going to do that. So I'm going to talk about kind of where we came from and where I come from, and a little bit of my experiences. And as Sherri mentioned, last year we were approached in various ways to work on this project for the Center for Naval Analysis and look at the implications of climate change and national security. And for me, it was pretty easy because of, as Sherri pointed out, some of the experiences I've had, particularly in the last job. And Ambassador Chevis, nice to see you. In European Command, again, 43 of the 53 countries, 54 countries in Africa were in the command that we interfaced with. We also had the Caucasus, Russia, Israel, Greenland, Iceland, and then all of Europe. And most of the time we spent in places that weren't doing very well, is what I always thought was a pretty good formula. You shouldn't spend a lot of time on things that are working. And therefore, we spent a lot of time in Africa. And one of the issues in European Command that came up during my tour, Jim Jones was the NATO commander, the commander of Europe, and I was his deputy, was a reevaluation of why we needed the forces we had in Europe, which today there are 115,000 active duty men and women in Europe, which sounds like a lot, it is, but right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, there were 315,000, so it has reduced quite a bit, but there's still a lot of active duty personnel stationed in Europe. And the review we went through had to do with, the reason we were there in the first place was obviously the Cold War and the bipolar competition with Russia and the Soviet Union. And when that went away, we all took a collective sigh of relief after the Cold War ended and took the peace dividend, and I think everybody kind of relaxed and said, let's get on with the world. And there was a guy, Francis Fukuyama, wrote The End of History, and I think a lot of people kind of thought it really was happened. When we got into the position in 2003, we were directed to do a strategic evaluation of the command, and it was, what are the threats, if any, and why would you even need this number of troops in Europe? And it turned out the threats that we determined without having to make them up, and we weren't trying to rationalize the troops. Matter of fact, if we could have gone to zero, it probably would be a good idea. I think some number of troops in Europe is a good thing for a lot of reasons we could talk about on a different topic. But the threats were basically, obviously, terrorism is a threat, or extremism, people that want to do harm to us, and then proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, either precursor or the actual weapons. Worst case would be a nuclear weapon getting in the wrong hands, particularly a terrorist. And energy security is another one that became a huge issue from a strategic geopolitical standpoint with the amount of effort the United States military puts into protecting the free flow of oil around the world is a strategic mission, and we do a lot of that, and it turns out a lot of it's in Africa, for example. And in Africa, the United States imports more oil from Africa today than we do from the Middle East. For many people don't know that, but we do. Also, the threat of Iran and the problems that they pose from the standpoint of both proliferation of weapons and their desire to potentially do harm in the Middle East. And then lastly, climate change. And you say, well, how did you come up with climate change? And in Africa specifically, I'll talk just a couple examples, but in the Darfur, for example, the original reason for the Darfur conflict with the problems they have there in Sudan were caused by migratory movement of farmers moving into herders' areas. And that conflict actually started over that. Now it's grown into something way beyond that. But it has to do with loss of arable land for the farmers caused by weather pattern changes. Whether that was global warming or not, it doesn't matter to me as a military man. It matters that we have a conflict caused by weather pattern changes. Mozambique in 1996 had a huge flood caused by 2 back-to-back typhoons. And literally the whole country was flooded. I mean, it's amazing when you see the pictures. And the U.S. military had to respond to that because of the magnitude of that problem. It could have been a man-made problem. It was, in this case, natural. And the only people that had a capacity to respond to that humanitarian crisis were, in this case, the United States military because of mobility and some other things. And then you look at what's happening in Africa because of documented weather changes. You're having a huge amount of disruption of the population and movement, and a severe amount of conflict, I think, will occur because of that. In Nigeria, they recently had an election, which has been debated as to how good that election was. But for those that haven't been to Nigeria, it's a very important country. As Ambassador Chevis was the ambassador to Sierra Leone when I was in European Command, and he can tell you from a regional perspective, Nigeria has an impact on what's going on because they're big, They play a role a little bit like Saudi Arabia does in the Middle East from the standpoint of stature. They have 160 million people, plus or minus. It's hard to get a good census, but probably in the at least 150 million range, which, for those that don't know, that's bigger than Russia. Their population is significantly split demographically, with Muslims in the north, Christians in the south. Most of the wealth in Nigeria, unfortunately, today is attained through selling oil, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but for countries that don't have a very good bureaucracy, it doesn't work out very good usually. You get a little, what they call Dutch disease, where the oil, all it really does is increase inflation, and they don't diversify the economy. In Lagos, what used to be the capital of Nigeria, is on the coast of Nigeria in a region called the Niger Delta. And many of the people there live in abject poverty. The first time I traveled there, it literally reminded me of a Mad Max movie. There was trash burning in the street, people all over the place, almost controlled chaos. And many of the people that live in Lagos live on stilted homes right on the water. And it's one of the most unbelievable things you've ever seen, somewhat like the slums in Brazil, but even worse. and the prediction is as the sea rises, which others will talk more specifically about some of this, is that many of those people will be displaced. If they're displaced inland in Nigeria, there's no place for them to go, and the government doesn't have the capacity to take care of them. And that probably will happen at some point. The question is, many people will say it's going to happen over a slower period of time, things can handle it, but the problem with some of the weather pattern changes we have is high tidal changes rapidly due to weather changes or weather storms. So it's a huge problem. And there are 36,000 Americans in Nigeria. So the U.S. military has a big job in working with the U.S. Embassy there for a plan called non-combatant evacuation in case of crisis. That would be one of our missions. You could go on through the continent of Africa for hours talking about some of these issues. And the reason I bring it up, not just that's specifically what you're concerned about, but from a military perspective, the new environment we're in, figuratively speaking, is going to take a new approach to national security. We're still going to have to maintain the conventional capabilities we've had in the past. And in military terms, you talk about spectrum of conflict. You have the low end of the spectrum, preferably peace, but maybe peacekeeping, and you move on up to the higher end where it goes all the way to nuclear exchange, but more likely a conventional conflict, somewhat like the first Iraq War, let's say, or something like that. And that's traditionally how military people look at the spectrum, and more of the funds go toward the higher spectrum conflict because it just takes more equipment. And in the past, less attention has been paid to the lower end, like we're involved in today in many places with terrorism and fundamentalism. And therefore, less of the budget goes there. And I'm not here to talk about bigger budgets for the military, don't get me wrong. But the fact of the matter is the military is going to have to pay attention to the spectrum in a larger way at the lower end while still keeping some focus on the big end of the spectrum. And to do that, we're going to have some pretty serious planning. And part of it would be, I think, and I'll finish with this and let the others speak, but is a strategy of prevention, which is a good thing. In military terms, for planning purposes, you have phases of conflict. You have the planning phase, which is traditionally called phase one. You have the deployment phase where you actually go where you're going to do whatever mission you have. And then you have that's phase two. Then you have employment, phase three, that's where you actually do the mission. And then four is return, redeployment. And that's been traditionally how military people think of conflict. And recently we've learned that there's probably at least a phase 4.5, if not 5, that we need to pay attention to. And that's post-conflict reconstruction. Very complicated, and preferably, if you really do it right, a phase 0, and that's how you prevent actually getting into a conflict. And in Africa, there is significant opportunity for phase 0 operations. That would be engaging with counterpart countries to build capacity for them to take care of their own problems, whether it be security or internal response to problems. It isn't, by the way, phase 0 is very small military part. It's mainly interagency, intergovernmental, non-government organizations, to help build good governance, good capacity for bureaucracy, education, health, you name it. And so our belief in European Command is we should be putting a significant amount of energy in phase 0, and also that climate change, based on the things that we've learned through scientific briefings, and as was mentioned, there is some skepticism. That's fine. In military terms, we don't plan just for 100%. If there's a chance of something really bad happening, we have to plan for it. And our conclusion, at least mine was in this case, that the chances of an outcome because of climate change, of bad things happening, is measurably possible. And in our case, my own personal case, likely unless something is done. And so therefore, as a responsible government, the military in this case, we should look at strategies that would primarily address what those could be and then see what we could do to mitigate the problem. If not, then at least adapt to them in the future. So that's, I think, where this report has value. So, Sherri.
Thank you very much, General Wald. I've had the privilege of working with General Kern, General Paul Kern, for a number of years. First, when he was the military assistant to Secretary of Defense Bill Perry. He later went on to be the commander of the Army's Materiel Command and oversaw all of logistics for the United States Army. And that experience, I think, has profoundly shaped his view about climate and national security. I will say at the time he's worked for the former Secretary of Defense, we sometimes traveled together when I was with Secretary Perry, and I'd say that in my portfolio in defense then, which included environment, I often got to see the back 40, while all these generals and admirals and the Secretary got to see the flight line and all the major military activity. I used to go see the dump in the back. So, but in any event, General Kern is very, very thoughtful on these issues, and he's now at the Cohen Group with former Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen, and we're very pleased to have him as our next speaker.
My name's not Sherri, it is Paul. It's hard to stretch that into anything that sounds like Sherri. When Sherri came back from the dumps, as she described it, however, she used to blame me on why all the oil was back there or other pieces of problems that we had left behind, and the usual message was go fix it. Well, that's kind of where we are on this, is looking at a problem and trying to figure out how do you go fix it. But we started from asking ourselves the question, is there really a problem to go fix? And so we spent a great deal of the time studying that part of it, listening to a number of the estimates from the true experts, from scientists from around the world, and from the UK, where we had a little bit different perspective, and you'll hear from that, I think, a little bit later. And we'd come back and you get in these debates of what is weather versus climate. And most of us can relate to weather. We experience it every day. It's harder to relate to climate, other than people study it and say we live in a temperate climate versus a very dry, arid climate or a frigid climate. But to see changes in that, which we can see in the weather every day, is fairly understandable to us. And that's where the debate usually ended up when I would speak to a lot of what I thought were very well-educated friends who had studied this and spent some time thinking about the problem. And they would say, well, if the weatherman can't get it right in the next 24 hours, how in the world are you trying to project what's going to happen in climate change in the next 25 years? And that's probably a fairly logical conclusion to come to, unless you really stop to think about it and say, if you really can't get the longer-term models right, how would you ever get the shorter-term models right? And as you really step back, there are lots of debates that you could go into, and we recognize that was not terribly useful. But the outcomes of it were useful for us to understand what might happen. I had the privilege of knowing a guy named Dr. Rick Smalley, who was a professor at Rice University and a Nobel laureate. Most people knew him for carbon nanotubes and bunky balls. which he really was very brilliant in the work that he did there. But he also had a category of the top 10 problems of the world. And you can argue which comes first or which comes second, but he always said that energy, water, environment, and food were going to be in the top 4. And I would argue that they're all related. And I also would argue that I really reflected back on my experiences in the Army. You often saw that instability resulted when you unbalanced those, and you took one of them away or you gave you too much of one or the other. And it often happened that that's what we would see. I can remember one exercise in the late 1980s. I was heading to Turkey, and as we were leaving the east coast of the United States, a hurricane was descending on the area, and we evacuated all of the aircraft, that's Army aircraft, which we couldn't put inside of a hangar, helicopters, and they tend to get blown around airfields if you don't. And then we sent all the families into gymnasiums and schools where they could be protected. And then we flew off. I thought that was very noble of us to leave. As it turned out, the hurricane did not hit where we were in Fort Stewart, Georgia, but it devastated Charleston. And one of my units that was left behind ended up having to go to Charleston to respond to that. The C-17 wing was just moving in at that time, and this was, from a military perspective, kind of upsetting. We had a big Navy facilities there at that time, a new airfield being built for the C-17 wing, and a lot of military effort that was going on. So I'd missed where we were and hit in the middle of Charleston. At the other end, I was trying to land in Turkey, and the ships we had to change to for various reasons were deep draft versus shallow draft so that we could get there on time. We had to change ports completely. And so again, we found that the waterfront changed, and that changed our military planning. And the next aspect that came out of that was the sea state changed, and we couldn't get into port. So we had to lay off offshore before we could start the operation, and then actually go into a deep water port, which was on the opposite side, and come across the isthmus to get the exercise started. So climate, sea state, hurricanes, all were playing into military operations, and the degree of which they became intense or intensified certainly changed the way we behaved in our operations. Some years later, I was involved in operations going into Rwanda and then what was then Zaire, and we weren't to address the military aspect of what had happened, but to address the aspects of the refugees that had resulted. And the biggest problem that the refugees were dealing with were lack of clean water, and more people were dying just from the ability to get to water. We then studied, in part of our exercises that we looked at, is what was going on in the deserts, the Sahara, expanding every year, causing more refugees again, not because of military action, but having the same impact, that people were moving to where they could survive, which clearly then was the lesson to me that people do live where they can survive. And that sounds rather simplistic, but if you don't have water, if you don't have food, and then the environment becomes either too hot or too cold, you move. And if you have borders that are limiting where you move, then you are crossing borders, and in today's world, where governments become involved, that results in immigration policies which are constraining people. And so those are cause instabilities, again, rather than allowing people to find places where they can survive. And so you keep seeing this pattern evolve of whether it's a weather change or a climate change, and the ability for people to find places where they can live. And I go back to Rick Smalley's comments. Yes, they are related, and yes, they are making a difference. And you can read books when you look at it now on water wars that have taken place around the world, and where people are in search of trying to find those elements of where they can survive. So I do believe that we really do see military implications, and we classified all of these as adding to the complicated part of how do you achieve stability. Military operations are kind of interesting when you look at them from the perspective that if you're on the defensive, you're trying to restore stability to something that was. If you're on the offensive, you're usually trying to create an instability so that you can take advantage of it and then bring it back to a stability that's more in your favor. But when you do that, I'm sitting between two Air Force guys. That's good.
Real good.
And it's good from the standpoint of how we measure
We've been
things.
carrying the Army around for years, man.
And we'll continue to. But what we look at it from the standpoint, so why do I bring that up? Well, if I just went into an operation by myself in the United States Army across the ground, I could probably do pretty well. If the Air Force went into an operation by themselves, they could do very well. But together, the sum is greater than two. And so you have what we then call a multiplier effect. And if you look at it from the adverse side, it's a threat multiplier effect. And we've come to the same conclusion about these climate changes. When you have these great instabilities which push people out of the places where they can survive, you have a multiplying effect on those instabilities. And that is reason for us to be worried. And when you look at it over a longer period of time, if you aren't paying attention, they creep up on you when it becomes too late to do something. And the last point is that what I have found in my career is one thing that the military does well is plan. And as Chuck said, when we plan, you look at the extremes of operations and you create different alternatives to how you can solve them, from the very worst to the very best cases. And so if you ask the military then to address these issues and look at climate change as a threat multiplier, you will begin to develop a series of things that you can do to reduce those instabilities, and those things that are going to be at the extreme cases. In our case, when we looked at the great nuclear threats versus smaller insurgencies, those are the extremes. And we look at those same things today and the great instabilities that can be caused because of climate change, where most of the people who live close to the oceans of the world, because that's where they can survive, small changes in sea levels can make a significant difference, both economically and in the way we live and the instabilities that they cause. So what we believe is a smart thing to do is plan now, look at the extremes of what can happen, and be prepared for those, and take advantage of this time that's available to us to reduce those extremes to something which is manageable. And those are the lessons that I learned, both from my career in the military and what I've observed over the last few months that Sherri has led us through in this study that we've done from the Military Advisory Board. Thank you.
Thank you, General Kern. Lieutenant General Larry Farrell also has a great deal of planning and programming experience. In fact, that was his last assignment in the Air Force as the Deputy Chief for Plans and Programs at the headquarters, United States Air Force. He now is president of the National Defense Industrial Association here in this area. And in his personal and professional career, he has really come to know well and to feel strongly about one of our findings, that climate change, national security, and energy dependence are a related set of global challenges. And also one of our recommendations about energy as an area in which he is very much involved. And we have one of our recommendations: the Department of Defense should enhance its operational capability by accelerating the adoption of improved business processes and innovative technologies that result in improved U.S. combat power through energy efficiency, which is a long-winded way of saying that there are opportunities to reduce the threats of climate change by improved energy efficiency in the military. General Farrell.
Thank you. So one of the reasons I'm so interested in the energy aspect of climate change is that climate change is somewhat hard to explain to people and to get people excited about, because even though it's coming at us fairly fast in geologic terms, it's not coming at us very fast in human terms. If you look at 1.5 degree rise in the last 100 years in the temperature of the Earth. So how do you deal with something like that? I mean, you can continue to debate the causes for climate change, which is fairly vigorous and ongoing at this point in my view, and still a fair debate. Or you can accept the fact that climate change is occurring, which seems pretty clear to most folks, and then to do something about some of the things that appear to impact on that. And I think energy is one of those things that you can do something about. It's a practical way to address the issue. I think most people feel like that we'd be more secure as a country, certainly, if we had more energy choices and if we were a little bit less dependent on the present petroleum-based sources of energy. So I think one way to move forward on this issue of climate change is to rethink our relationship to energy without getting into the debate on the science. Many of the things which we can do to change energy consumption will also help us to begin to play a leadership role on climate solutions. So it kind of scratches two itches at the same time, it seems to me. Now, I've been aware of the relationship of energy and national security, as we all are, because of what we've experienced in our careers. But for me, when I went through this study, the new element was the added stress that brought about when climate change is added to the mix. So energy becomes even more important for me. When you look at energy on the battlefield, it is really a key determinant of the success of our forces. If you can move men and material quickly on the battlefield, you can move with less tonnage, but at the same level of protection and firepower, let's say, you're much more efficient. Most people don't realize, but 70+%, maybe as much as 75 to 80% of the tonnage that we move on the battlefield is just fuel and water. Ammo and food and all the other stuff we move really pales in comparison. So you see that energy is not only a pressing logistics challenge, but it also is a security challenge on the battlefield. It's also an operational limitation on the battlefield because of the logistics tail and the movement considerations involved in getting it around the battlefield. You read every day about IEDs in Iraq. What are these people blowing up? What are their targets? Well, their targets are our convoys. We move a lot of stuff around the battlefield. So efficiency in this area adds not only to security on the battlefield, it also increases your battlefield options. So that's really important. And then there are the places that we have to go in the world to obtain our present form of energy. That presents a serious national security challenge to us right now. The places where we go to get it are tough neighborhoods. We expend considerable resources in this country to stabilize the conditions for reasonable business relationships to underwrite the access to that energy. If you look at some of the calculations on what we're actually paying for a gallon of gas, it's more than $3.25 a gallon. It's probably $8 or $9 or $10 or $15 a gallon when you add in all of the things that we have to do as a country to protect the access to that. So, climate change, we think, is likely to add to instability to a number of these places, making our access to this form of energy all the more demanding. So that's another aspect of it most people don't think about. So developing more efficient energy innovations and sources that are more efficient on the battlefield, they improve our battlefield operational logistics performance, but it also reduces our dependence on difficult foreign sources while simultaneously reducing the potential for our involvement in conflict in those places. And I think that's probably one of the most important things you can conclude about that. The report itself was careful to note that climate change is underway, but at the same time to stay out of the debate. And I think that's something you can kind of foot stomp here. We can debate that all day, and maybe we agree and we disagree on some of that. But the beauty of viewing military energy innovation with a focus on renewable and efficient forms, it avoids that debate, and it also has the advantages of uniting advocates on both sides of the debate because it addresses from a more neutral point of view the carbon issue while offering solutions that advocates on both sides can agree upon. You can talk about the need to put it in our intelligence estimate. General Kern and General Wald have already addressed that, but we in the military, if we do anything, we plan. And we view everything as a risk. Even if it's something we can't quantify or we don't quite understand, we quantify it as a risk and we deal with it through our planning. So that's one of the reasons that we were strong on putting this in the National Intelligence Estimate, not to get into the debate on the science, but to increase the momentum of the military planning and the intelligence focus that we put on this, and we think that's important. You can also view it in terms of the war on terror, because, look, where do terrorists go? They go to weak places. They go to places where governance is weak, where societies are weak, where societies can't deal with the present problems, and there's an opportunity for terrorists to move in and to gain a foothold. So if the stress of climate change on these weak societies causes some of them to collapse more, it just opens up a window for terrorists. And it not only goes to the causes of terrorism, but it also goes to the levers and access that terrorists seek. So I would say one final thing with respect to the military. What we do in the military is we organize, we train, and we equip for war. And the planning that we do that goes into our organizing, training, and equipping considers all the risks that we face. And one of the risks I think that we see right now is climate change. Sherri asked me, in addition to addressing the energy issue, to say a little bit about Asia. And I'll say, and I would say you ought to get out the report and read it. It's a good report. It's very short, it's concise, it's well reasoned, and it's got a lot of information packed into a small space. But if you look at the section on Asia, I think that all you have to do is say, how many people are there in the world today? There's about 6.5 billion people. Where do 4 billion of them live? They live in Asia. 40%, or almost half of those people, are within 45,000 miles, or 45 miles of the coast. If you look at where they get their water from, they get them from glaciers that come off the Tibetan Plateau, and they get them from snow melt in the Himalayas. The Tibetan Plateau, which feeds the people on the eastern side, is drying up. That means there's going to be less water for those people on the eastern side. The melt from the Himalayas is increasing, so the people in the western catchments are going to have more water, more than they need, and probably more precipitation. And that's people like India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. People on the other side, China, South Asia, they're going to be short of water. And if you look at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, they see a net cereal production reduction in the next few years of 4 to 10% in South Asia. That's an extraordinary statistic for me. And then if you look at where's the world going in the next few years, by 2050, the population of the world is projected to reach 9.5 billion from about 6.5 billion today. That's kind of frightening, but if you look at the places where it's going to happen, it's happening in 9 countries in the world. One of those is the U.S. That's the only developed country in the world where 80% of the growth is going to take place. The rest of it's going to be India, China, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and then when you go to Africa, it's going to be Nigeria, Ethiopia, Congo, and Uganda. And those are places where there's already stresses and instabilities. And so if all the population growth is going to take place there, and you put all these environmental stresses that Chuck talked about for Africa, and I just mentioned for Asia, it could be a big problem for us. Thank you.
Thank you, General Farrell. Our last speaker is David Thomas, First Secretary at the British Embassy here in Washington, D.C. We had the honor, the Military Advisory Board and our team went to London and visited with the British government, from 10 Downing Street to the Ministry of Defense and the Foreign Office and their highly respected Hadley Center on climate change in last fall. And we learned as well as business leaders, we learned a great deal about the leadership that the British government and the British people have shown on climate change. Dave has had previous postings in Lagos, Pretoria, and in London. Prior to joining the diplomatic service, he was a police officer in Bedfordshire Constabulary, and here's the one I like the best. It included a 3 secondment to the Royal Cayman Islands Police. Now that's a choice assignment, at least as long as climate change hasn't destroyed the coral reef there. Okay, David, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm neither called Sherri or I'm neither called Sherri or a retired general, but I will try and add some value to the comments from my prestigious colleagues here. And I'd like to thank Jeff and Sherri, first of all, for inviting me to take part in this event. We had the report at the British Embassy, it's circulated round, and everyone thought it was excellent. And I think there's no more stronger testament to that than the fact I was listening out to a couple of speeches that my Foreign Secretary, Margaret Beckett, made last week. And actually she quotes quite heavily from the report. So I think that's an indication of the weight and importance that British government attached to it. So I'd also like to start with a quote, and I think it's one that you started with, Sherri, which is that climate change can act as a threat multiplier for instability in some of the most volatile regions of the world. For it was that belief that prompted the UK to hold the debate at the United Nations Security Council some weeks ago. I was at the debate, and although I wasn't at the core table, I was sitting in the sidelines. I'd like to share a few highlights from that. There was actually more participation in this United Nations Security Council thematic debate by member states, 55 in total, than in any previous thematic debate that they've held in the Council chambers. In fact, the United Nations Security General, Ban Ki-moon, who was only due to make an appearance for a few minutes at the debate, ended up staying for about an hour and a half, and during his intervention, he made it clear that he considered climate change a serious security threat. In fact, the vast majority of countries agreed with him. These included China, who had more problems with the venue than the actual issue that was being discussed, and the bulk of developing countries. And a number of remarks stood out for me that I'd like to share with you now. Ghana, who spoke of growing evidence that nomadic Fulani cattle herdsmen were in conflict with local farming communities who were threatening their herds. And they said that climate change, expanding from the Sahara Desert, was responsible. There was an increase in tension, and I think this is a stark reminder that these things are happening today. Papua New Guinea, for itself and the number of small island states, said that a sea rise level of just 0.5 metre would put many of these small islands' survival entirely at risk. And they want the United Nations Security Council to keep this issue under continuous review and look at the implications for sovereignty and international legal rights from loss of land, resources and people. Bangladesh, as just mentioned by my colleague, they've expressed the fear that climate change will become a major security concern, highlighting that their country's position sits on top of a river delta. They're concerned that snowmelt from the Himalayas will increase sea level and cause flooding with tragic consequences. Namibia stated that developing countries are essentially suffering a sort of form of low-intensity biological warfare from greenhouse gas emissions coming from developed countries. And this links to a comment made recently by President Museveni from Uganda, who said he was the first African leader to call climate change an act of aggression by the rich against the poor. And finally, Congo, who stated that this will not be the first time that people have fought over land, water, and other resources, but this time it will be on a scale that dwarfs the conflicts of the past. So that debate, as with your report, has successfully drawn attention to this issue, and we're pleased that it continues to resonate in the corridors of the UN. In fact, other related bodies are stepping up their engagement. It appears there'll now be a thematic debate at an official level in the General Assembly in June. The Chief Executives Board, which is a board made up of the heads of the 30 UN agencies, including the World Bank, have agreed that the UN should develop further options for a more coherent operational response to climate change. It also looks likely that Ban Ki-moon will call a high-level meeting on climate change in Unga Week in September, when the heads of government gather for a week. Ban Ki-moon has also appointed 3 special envoys on climate change to help facilitate progress on the ongoing multilateral negotiations for a post-2012 future framework on climate change. And I should add that in Europe, this issue is also on the agenda for EU foreign ministers to discuss at their next meeting before they meet in the summer. Now, there have been those that have suggested that we, the UK, and others would be better off concentrating on the real security problems in the world. And I was sitting at the weekend wondering how I might respond to that charge if it was raised in this forum, when, fortuitously for me, I found that Margaret Beckett had in fact made a speech on Friday on that subject. So I unashamedly am now going to quote from that speech, and the whole thing can be reached at britanusa.com. I'm just going to give you a small portion. So in her words, "I simply do not believe that we will solve the security issues of the day until we address the global insecurities that underlie and execute them. And I do not think I would be doing my job properly if I considered it enough to respond to each crisis as it occurs. The foreign policy that I will pursue is one that looks down the line at how we can prevent such crises from happening at all. In other words, I attach no less importance to the hard security agenda, but I'm looking for the broadest and deepest possible understanding of what drives that agenda. Whilst an unstable climate has obvious hard security implications, the traditional tools of hard security, in simple terms, bombs and bullets, are not going to solve the problem. Instead, we're going to have to think a lot more imaginatively, a lot more broadly, about how we can act together to guarantee that kind of security. This will mean much greater understanding of and commitment to non-military options, to international diplomacy, leveraging international finance and markets, building coalitions between governments, business and consumers. In other words, we're going to have to get a lot more hard-headed about how we use soft power. Of course, governments can't do this on their own, nor can the private sector or any individual. We all have to play a part. Governments putting in place the long-term frameworks of goals, regulations and incentives, business having the confidence to take and follow that lead and to start switching investment, consumers making the right choices and keeping the pressure up on others to do the same. In short, we're looking at nothing less than the greatest public-private partnership of all time. And that was a speech he gave at the Royal United Services Institute Day last week. I personally think that bringing in the security community to this debate has a number of advantages. When people talk about security problems, they do so in a qualitatively different form from any other type of problem. Security is seen as an imperative, not an option. People don't obsess over cost-benefit analyses or about opportunity cost. They just get on with what has to be done, because they understand that security goes right to the heart of the basic contract between state and citizen. In the same vein, when it comes to security, you prepare for the worst-case scenario. You don't sit around and hope for the best. And as General Sullivan is quoted saying in this report, if you wait until you have 100% certainty on the battlefield, something bad is going to happen. If we wait to act on climate change, then something very bad is going to happen indeed. So having raised the issue of climate security up the agenda, and having put it on the table at the UN Security Council, where to now? Well, the UK looks forward to the G8 summit at Heiligendamm in June and the next UN meeting in Bali in December, both where we hope a discussion on a post-2012 framework on climate change can be progressed. For its part, feeding into these discussions, the EU has actually already laid out a basic frame of its own plans for post-2012. There was a meeting a few weeks back of heads of government, and I just want to lay out a few of the more ambitious targets that they agreed. A 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2020, based on 1990 baselines. In the energy mix, a 20% renewables target. An aspiration to be 20% more energy efficient by 2020, and have a 10% biofuels mix, again, by 2020. And possibly the most important first steps to decarbonise the entire EU power sector by 2020. The building of 12 commercial-scale carbon capture and storage demos across Europe by 2015, leading to all new fossil fuel power plants built to be carbon neutral by 2020. I just want to pause and reflect on that. That's quite something, to decarbonise the power sector in the EU by 2020. The UK is supporting this with its own climate bill and plans to be the first country to enshrine in law our own target of a 60% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. We hope that other countries will follow suit. So once again, I'd like to thank this panel and Sherri for the report, and thank you very much for inviting me today.
Before I forget, there are copies of the excellent report out on the table. Be sure to take one, read, and absorb. Mr. Thomas, eloquent words quoting your foreign minister.
Plagiarism is the best.
Oh, yeah, hard-headed about using soft power. And all of the generals, pretty heady atmosphere for a guy who started out as a police constable and an MP who rose to the lofty rank of specialist third class to be with these distinguished panelists up here. But they've all had the same theme. We have to deal responsibly with the threat of global climate change. We don't need to have arguments about the science. We have to deal with the practical aspects of it. As General Kern said, reason for us to be worried. And General Wald said, we need some pretty serious planning. And General Farrell summed it up, why? the success of our forces depend upon it. Pretty darn important. Now what we're going to do is have a discussion for the next, hour or so with these distinguished panelists. And I will ask that you identify yourself when you ask questions. We're going to have a couple of people on each side with microphones. So we'll ask the staff to bring a microphone to you. We ask that you try to condense your question and not make a lengthy statement. And we'll go from there. Who's got the first question? Let's give Jeff the honor of the first question because you worked so hard to put this whole program together.
Thank you, Sherri. It shouldn't be for that. But Jeff DeBelco here at the Wilson Center. Thank you all very much. It's been terrific to hear you today, as well as we appreciate the effort that you have all taken to take this to different quarters, including this last week in front of Senate Foreign Relations Committee with General Wald appearing there. I have two questions. One for the gentleman from the Military Advisory Board. Generals, how do you see the report that you've done with quite obviously a U.S. national security lens, connecting to what Mr. Thomas has suggested in the UN forum and international engagement? And I know the report had some things to say about that, and your comments on how you see these two coming together. And second, for General Wald, with the planned stand-up of Africa Command here in September, are there opportunities that you see for these issues to be addressed in that format, and how you see that different structure playing out on these issues?
Should I go first? I'll answer the the last question first, and then comment on the other one, and then pass it on down the line a little bit. But Africa Command is actually a perfect example of being hard-headed about soft power. I mean, that's a good quote. I'm going to steal it and give credit where credit's due. But the concept for Africa Command is a couple things. One is Africa has emerged as a strategic place in its own right that deserves a lot of attention, and maybe it emerged before, but we finally recognized it for a lot of reasons. Two, the solution set in Africa militarily, as was discussed several times here, not traditional. Now, there are ungoverned spaces, there are issues there militarily. Many of them have to do with crises like Rwanda or Sierra Leone, for example, where the Brits did a superb job. Liberia, Darfur, there are these civil strife problems, but they aren't the real high end of the spectrum military conflict. Now, a person dying doesn't care if that's high end or low end, it's bad for them, but they're going to take the stability of the region, and the geostrategic challenges are the broad spectrum ones, the diplomatic, we call it DIME, diplomatic, information, military, and economic. And Africa, for the U.S., I think, has been treated as a little d, little I, capital M, little e problem. And it should be a capital D, capital I, little m, capital E problem. And so Africa Command will have, and we started this in European Command, it's not necessarily unique. In U.S. Lingo for the military, they have what's called combatant commands, and they are regionally oriented and stationed commands, and there are 5 of them. Right now, European Command was explained, and that's a misnomer, but there's Pacific Command, there's Southern Command, which is South America, and Central Command, which is the Middle East primarily, and then Northern Command. And all the commands are starting to have more representation from government in their commands. In European Command, we had a senior USAID person on the staff, which took a little bit of convincing with the people that were running AID at the time. We have a senior Treasury person. We have a senior person from the Department of Defense Acquisition and Technology on the staff. We're looking to have Homeland Security, and these people are at the general officer equivalent level. And the reason is that the challenges over there are these long-term, multifaceted that David and I think Foreign Minister Beckett so eloquently discussed, that it's how do you get into the prevention phase primarily and address problems that are inevitably going to occur before they occur, and it's a multifaceted approach. So that's, and Africa Command will be a hybrid command. Now, my personal feeling is long-term, it should not be a military command that does it. It ought to be made into a regional, probably a super ambassador of some sort, because I mean, one of the reasons we fight is for civilian control, believe it or not. So I don't think it's necessarily a military problem. So that's where I come down on Africa Command. What was the first question again?
Engagement with the UN and the
Oh, yeah. Real quickly, because I don't want to take up all the time. I think it's natural when we talk to the United Kingdom Foreign Minister's Office and a man called Justin Mundy that I think, David, you know. This is going to have to be a globally addressed problem. And my personal opinion is, and I think maybe Paul mentioned this a little bit, but this is a perfect opportunity for the United States to show responsible leadership in the world again. And we don't have to be the leader, but we're going to have to do some leading. And I heard yesterday on TV, I thought was a really good quote from Senator Hagel. He said the world is a dangerous place, but it's even more dangerous without the United States engaged properly. And I think that's a good point. And I think it's going to take the United States, not just because we use 25% of all the energy in the world, but because we still are a part of the leadership. And I think it would be a very good thing for the United States to demonstrate visionary leadership in this area. And we're going to have to use more than just the governments themselves. There are a lot of non-governmental organizations that will be involved in this in the new world when you address problems. And so I think it's a natural to start bringing the world together to address a common problem and start working on multilateralism again, personally.
General Kern?
I absolutely agree with Chuck's comments, and we have to be leaders in this business of global climate change because we just happen to be leaders in this world. And with Senator Hagel's comment, I think reflects that. If we don't, then we sit back and we bear the consequences of those problems that occur where instability breaks out and we have to do something in a reactionary mode. And that's not the best way to deal with the issue. The one thing I think that I would give as a simple example is that we have had some debate on is the fact that China today is building a new power plant at the rate of somewhere between once a week or every 10 days, and you can pick the statistic you want, and most of them are going to be coal-fired power plants. And the United States also, at the same time, sits on top of most of the energy resources in the world of fossil fuel. They just happen to be coal. We could have zero dependence on petroleum if we could figure out how to deal with coal in a clean method. And now the issue is, what do we do about that from an international perspective? Do we share solutions with the Chinese? The winds do blow from the west. Do we ignore the problem? Or do we try to find some solution from a leadership position in the world on how we can solve this for an international perspective so that we do know how to solve problems and share those answers so that we avoid the instabilities which can occur sometime in the future? So those are the type of things I think that we are going to need to look at from an international perspective on how we demonstrate our ability to be leaders in this world.
General Wald?
Farrell?
Oh, you've already done, yeah. General Farrell?
Well, I would just say that this report does two things that are new. Number one, it comes from a group of guys that people don't expect to hear talk about this, but which have some credibility with the American people. That's number one. And number two, it deals with the subject in a very pragmatic and straightforward way. So I think it has a potential of increasing the momentum of the U.S. towards cooperation on an international basis.
Questions? Would you identify yourself as a...
I'm Alan Hoffman. I'm with the U.S. Department of Energy. First, I want to congratulate the panel and CNA on getting this report out. It's long overdue. This is a very critical issue, and I do want to give credit to the Defense Department, which has been concerned about this for a long time. I know when Tony Zinni was head of CENTCOM, he was very focused on this issue. So this is not a new thing for the defense people. My question, in a sense, is for Sherri Boehlert, because the Congress hasn't been mentioned much here in this discussion so far. And if the United States is to get serious about addressing global climate change, there is a role for the U.S. Congress. And it seems to me that one of the critical things is putting a floor under the price of oil so that the investments can be made in the alternatives without a fear that the price of oil is going to drop again and people just won't make the investments. How do you feel about the possibility of Congress actually putting a floor under the price of oil, which didn't seem reasonable a couple of years ago because of the political situation? And I'd be interested in your comments as well, the rest of the panel.
Well, as a former member, I might underline former member, the problem with that, Congress more often than not punts when serious questions are asked. Experience, history tells us that. But the comforting fact is this time around, it looks like they're finally getting serious about it all. And it took Inconvenient Truth. It took specials on CNN and all the channels, television channels. You can't turn around without seeing something in the popular Main Street media about this very subject and how we deal with it in a responsible way. I doubt if they'll put a floor on it, but I don't speak from inside now, I speak from the outside. But I do think they're getting very serious about it, and one of the new speakers' first task was to appoint a select panel on global climate change and charge that panel with reporting out something before the end of this summer. And they're moving apace, and all the indications are that they're really going to do something meaningful. Now, what that something is highly debatable, but it looks like a cap-and-trade program. And they're fortified, they're strengthened in their resolve by the business community coming forward. More and more companies are coming forward to join the business partnership. GM was just the latest one to join, but DuPont and General Electric and some of the biggest names in industry. And now you've got the religious movement, the evangelicals are in. The National Association of Evangelicals have talked about the stewardship responsibility. So you've got a lot of movement. And once again, I think this is a clear example where the public is way ahead of the policymakers, and now the policymakers are responding to public opinion, and that's positive. Is there a likely carbon tax of some sort to be imposed? They're sort of shying away from something like that, but I think you're going to see a cap-and-trade program, and I think you're going to see some meaningful targets around the magnitude of 50% by 2050, but that's just a guess from one observer.
Yeah, let me just say something, Sherri.
Sure.
I think there are much more direct things that the U.S. government could do. We didn't get into recommendations here, but I have some strong thoughts about it. I think the U.S. government has terrific buying power. If they say, I'm going to buy this kind of thing, I'm going to put my money up, boy, the market goes in that direction. I don't see any of that. I'd much rather see the U.S. government do something like, say, this is the only kind of car I'm going to buy. And it's going to have these characteristics, it's going to have these mileage characteristics, and I'm going to start in a year, and that's all I'm going to buy. If we go short on vehicles, that's tough, but that's it. I'd also like to see them say something like, we're going to take the 10 largest military bases in the CONUS, and in 5 years are going to be run totally on renewable forms of energy, those 10 bases, so that the government would use its buying power to develop technology that could actually be deployed into something the government uses, and then it's going to spread to the rest of the economy. But just putting a floor on the price of gas doesn't necessarily translate that into something that would be positive. So I think there's a lot the government can do, but they're not. I don't think they're doing.
Chairman, I don't want to divert from this, but I also point out that for 3 successive Congresses, I carried the amendment to mandate increased CAFE standards, corporate average fuel economy standards. And the first Congress, back in the 107th, I got 160 votes for my amendment. The second Congress, 108th, I got 162. The 109th Congress, I got 177. Gradually, as more people were better informed, the votes increased. And then in the 109th Congress in the fall, there was another energy package, and I went before the Rules Committee to ask for a vote on my amendment, thinking, of course they're going to grant it. They did in the 3 previous times, and what happened? They didn't grant a rule. And one could speculate that they took an informal whip check and discovered I had the votes this time. And they said, well, nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. Katrina, $3 a gallon gasoline, and the American consumers were finally waking up to the reality that increased cafe standards would be a significant savings to them every time they go to the corner gas station, less frequently, but fill up for $50, $60. So I think we're going to see cafe standards. But General Farrell is right on target with that. And to the credit of the Congress and the federal government, we are investing a lot more in alternative energy sources. We're investing a lot more in clean coal technology, for example, and coal is abundant and affordable and available. So we're doing a lot of things, but let's go to the panel. Yes, General.
I'd make one comment that I think what the point of it all is that what this country responds to most directly are economic incentives or disincentives, depending upon which way you want to look at it. And until we do that, people don't get serious about how they're going to behave, and that's how you change behaviors. But I'd say there's a secondary caution to that we really need to look at, and I'll go back to my friend Rick Smalley's. There are 4 issues, at least, on top of this, and they're all related. If you want to produce more food, you put more fertilizer and water on the ground. In today's world, that causes you to cost more energy. And so the circle of energy, food, and water comes together. And if the environmental conditions say you want to irrigate a desert, that costs you more energy, more water as well, so you can produce the food. And so the way we're establishing our laws and the way we look at committees in our Congress are going to have to view the incentives and the unintended consequences of some of them, I think, more collectively than we have in the past. And so one of the real challenges of this whole problem is that it's not just one group or another, and it's not just one particular aspect of how you look at it. You've got to look at the problem very broadly to really get a good solution. Bottom line, though, is we do respond to the bottom line, and that is what I think will cause us to change.
Mr. Thomas?
Just to support something that General Farrell said, actually this week in New York is a summit entitled C40, and it's a gathering of mayors and other leaders from the 40 cities in the world that have the largest carbon footprint. And they're there to share ideas on how they can reduce their footprint. And one of the big ideas coming out of it is to share procurement and get the cost curves down. The simple things that cities all around the world need to buy, from light bulbs in lampposts and so on. And so it'll be interesting to watch what comes out of that.
Lots of hands. Microphone done.
I'm Paul Stern from the National Research Council. I was curious to know, I haven't read the report yet, what is being done and what do you think needs to be done to understand the links from climatic changes that are expected to particular kinds of insecurities in particular places? Is that something that you feel that the military and the intelligence community have done a good job of thinking through, or is there a gap there?
Well, I think we're getting better data all the time, and the 4th IPCC has, by being able to provide some regional analyses, is very helpful in that regard. It's really still a beginning and a place to start. And now that in terms of the national security implications, there's much more work and research and analysis that can and should be done. The intelligence community is already begun its work in this area, and is to try to understand this on a more regional and in-depth basis, and is actively looking at what at these types of concerns. And I think that you will see more research. We need to be able to get down to to take it from, the most macro level down into regional levels. But the challenge, of course, is as you narrow your geographic area, then the predictions become less reliable. And so that's the tension that I'm sure you well know from an NRC standpoint. And that's kind of one of the challenges that we've dealt with in our work, and that I think will continue. But as the models and the research improves, that you'll be able to tighten up on the geographic region about which one can make a meaningful prediction into some future period of time.
Anybody else care to comment on that?
Hello, my name is Aaron Ewell with the LaRouche's 21st Century Science and Technology. I have a question on strategy, and generals probably know a bit of the history behind the Athenian city-state and how the Persian Empire launched a three-front war against the city-state. Basically, they had land and sea, and they couldn't defeat the Athenian city-state, so they had to use paganism. They had to actually convince the Athenians of non-truths, in which then they launched the Peloponnesian Wars that ended the Athenian city-state. Now, we have the same situation today where the British Empire, right, under Winston Churchill and others who were against FDR's idea of ending colonialism and beginning a process of actually reestablishing the American system of political economy across the world with Russia, cooperation with Russia, China, India, and the U.S., as was done when Mendeleev went over to came over to the United States and brought back the centennial celebration of 1876 to Russia to create a Bering Strait tunnel to link the United States and Russia and begin to end the British Empire rule of sea. Now, the Cayman Islands, as you probably know, is the leading hedge fund operation in the world. And they're currently operating to destroy a lot of our infrastructure. Now, I would ask you if you guys really understand the current strategic problems that we're facing with the current financial system collapsing, the current individuals involved.
I think you're getting really
Islands.
far afield from where the panel in this particular report. But it's an interesting topic, and one demands a serious discussion at a later time. This is not the panel for that. We're talking about this report, and we're privileged to have some very distinguished panelists here who can offer some. So if you've got a quick question, get to the question.
Do you guys understand how paganism actually destroys countries?
Thank you. Thanks very much. Next question.
I would say that the Persians did not start the Peloponnesian War.
I was also going to mention.
It sounded like you were saying that.
I was also going to mention. I think only David Thomas could answer that question.
Thanks for that.
Oh, we've got a question over here. Thank you.
I'm John McCormick with the Energy Policy Center, and I want to thank you all, and that includes you, Mr. Chairman, for your public service. You've also helped to put to rest the idea that climate change is a hoax. Now, I want to talk about something very specific. The discussion now in Washington is, should the U.S. wait for China? And the thought is, no, the U.S. should get on its horse and get ahead and start moving, and China will follow. Well, I'm not certain about that. And as I see, China and India have so much to lose in the next 30 or 40 years that perhaps the United States won't feel that kind of pain. It is time perhaps for the U.S. to say to India and China, we can't do this alone. We've got to hold hands from the get-go. And I would even begin with the thought that China is now building coal to liquids plants. Well, they'll continue to do that. The United States is considering that. I think an agreement between the U.S. and China that we will not go in that direction is a good way to start. And I'd like some comment on, should we wait for China, or should we have China sitting at the same table with us from the get-go?
Well, I would direct your attention to the remarks of Admiral Preer Joseph Prier, who's a member of our Military Advisory Board, and his testimony before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee last week, where he spoke very specifically and eloquently to your very good question. And he has said not engaging China is not an option here. Of course, he was also ambassador to China. And I think he believes, and many others do, that we need to work very closely with China, and we need to, if possible, form a technology partnership with them, and that transferring our technology to them is to our benefit, because it gives us economic opportunities, as well as helps them address the fact that they will be dependent on coal for years to come, and must find ways to make that dependence on coal a cleaner option for them.
Yeah, Sherri, I couldn't agree more. Admiral Prier is the expert on China, but personal opinion is China is the most important country that we should be engaged with today, period. Yeah, along with our British friends. It's kind of like Canada. Everybody loves Canada, I think, in America. You go up there and they resent us because we don't pay attention to them. And I don't want to have the Brits think we're cocky. So, but along with Britain and our strong allies, China, and I really am encouraged with Secretary Paulson's engagement with China. I think that is a very good thing he's doing for our country. As Paul mentioned, China in Maslow's theories, and that's Paul's kind of hierarchy, you got to have air, water, food, shelter, clothing, and all this stuff. China's
simple when you live on the ground.
Yeah, it's very simple, but it's important. And China's in a different area in Maslow's hierarchy than we are in America. I mean, they're working to get out of poverty. They're going to have their effort is to try to get twice as many people as America has, 600 million, out of poverty in the next decade or two, which is going to be very challenging. And so they're saying to themselves, "Hey, here's the priority. I need energy. I need the industry. I need to grow this thing. And number one priority is get more people in the middle class. And the only way I can do that affordably is through coal." I talked to a person that works for one of the major oil companies in Beijing a couple months ago, and they're helping the Chinese, this company, develop clean coal technology. They're trying to. And this guy was coughing the whole time on the phone. It's just unbelievable, the pollution. And I heard a week ago that some of the refineries on the west coast of the United States now are having a little bit of difficulty because of pollution that's coming in from China, because there's such a sensitivity of the screening on these things. So just from a practical standpoint, we ought to be helping. Now, I was on another testimony on one of the committees about a month ago, and a person asked one of the expert witnesses, "Do you think we should share clean coal technology with China?" Of course, the answer was yes. The real answer is if we had it, we'd do it. And we asked the Brits in number 10 Downing Street what their plan was, and the UK plans to share clean coal technology with China. Unfortunately, it's 2015. And so to answer your question, number one, strategically, China doesn't have to be an adversary. They're going to be a competitor. I mean, that's what we do. We're Adam Smith, we compete. But they ought to be a partner. Two is we should have a national program to develop clean coal technology. And once we get it, we ought to share it, is what I think. So.
Yeah, I just couldn't agree more. I mean, how do you avoid 1.3 billion people who are building power plants at a great rate just to catch up with us? I mean, that's their objective, and they're fairly clear about it. And we all share in the same problem and would all benefit by the good solution. So I think it's an easy one to follow.
Mr. Thomas.
I would just say that the urgency of this problem doesn't allow us to wait for a sort of you first attitude. We have to act if we can. That's all the developed countries now. And talking of China and the US and a role the UK can play, actually we found we can be something of a facilitator. Sir Nick Stern, who you may know produced a report on the economics of climate change last year, travelled China extensively and came to the US extensively. And he was actually quite surprised that in visiting both countries, neither seemed to be very aware of what was going on. So in China, they were saying, what the hell are the US doing? There's no action on climate change at all. And Nick Stern stood in front of some of the committees and the hearings here and got the same question about China. What the hell are they doing? And Nick Stern developed a bit of a patter about what China actually was doing. And I remember some of the sound bites that China is actually foresting and not deforesting. Its 11th five-year plan in terms of energy efficiency is much stronger than anything that the US or the EU have. You can't buy a US car in China, for example, because its engine efficiency standards are so high. There's export duties preventing carbon-heavy industries establishing themselves in China. So I think we need to all raise our levels as well of education and awareness of what's happening in the developing countries where they are making some efforts. Now, there are infrastructure issues, sure, there's a long way to go, sure, but there are things, positive things happening. And I do recall a few weeks ago a soundbite from the news that Japan and China have just signed an agreement to explore a sort of post-2012 framework, which shows they are willing to engage in the next sort of post-Kyoto phase.
Before the next question, join me in thanking General Kern. He has a commitment he has to meet, and when I get orders from a general, specialist third-class Boehlert says, yes, sir. Thank you very much, General Kern. Question?
Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting conference. In the Cold War days, I was a beneficiary of the Department of Defense Fund studying ice from T3 Ice Island in the Arctic. Now, the Arctic is not a main track for immigration, but does the open water leads in the Arctic Ocean come into any scenarios from a military standpoint?
Yeah, I think so. Right now, the thing is kind of iced over, but when it becomes uniced over, there's going to be a rush to settle claims, which are only potential claims at this point, claims to resources and fisheries and all that kind of stuff. And you add to that the fact that countries like the United States and Canada don't have the naval assets to patrol water like that or even to control it. So it's a huge potential security problem because we don't have any assets, and the potential for what could arise there is quite large. So.
Yeah, there is the prediction that within several decades the Arctic could be ice-free in the summer, and that will raise a number of challenges General Farrell has just mentioned, as well as how to deal with the Northwest Passage, whether those are under international laws, whether those waters are actually international or whether they're territorial. And that's just an example of the types of issues that can arise as the Arctic changes.
Well, just a real quick comment on that. First of all, I agree with both of them 100%, but you don't want to stretch, these issues. I mean, we thought about a lot of things, and being kind of inquisitive minds, we came up with a lot of questions. But one of the issues that kind of goes back to this national intelligence estimate issue is actually thinking in things in different terms that you hadn't necessarily thought of before, particularly from the standpoint of acquisition, for example. And the acquisition competition in the military, even within the services, is an unbelievably tense issue from the standpoint, what are you going to, as much money as the military gets is still, it's hard to get some of the stuff you need to have. And one of the issues will be, how do we actually build some of our equipment? In the U.S. Air Force, for example, and I think all the services for sure, are concerned about fuel consumption and battlefield weight and all that, but new engines potentially, et cetera. And that's very difficult because aircraft engines are really hard to change and design. But once you get them, you're going to have them. And kind of one of the examples I wanted to bring up was the B-52 bomber in the United States Air Force. When we retire that aircraft, it'll be 90 years old. Now, you think, well, 90 years from now, there's a lot of change coming. So we ought to be thinking about it. The other part is, that kind of brought it to mind, was this ship issue. In a lot of places where some of the threats are today is really shallow water, or even riverine type warfare, which we, matter of fact, got away from after Vietnam, and now we're getting back into it. But you have to buy a certain kind of equipment for that. And it takes lead time and money, and you have to do the debate on all that. And it seems like it's stretching it a little bit, but it's not. It's huge. I mean, it's one of the most difficult things. Matter of fact, General Farrell used to be in charge of that for the Air Force as far as planning for equipment for the future, and I watched him in action, and it's not easy when you think you know what you're going to face, much less what potentially could be. So it's another part of the military planning, I think, that goes back into why this is an issue for us.
Pardon me? Right here? Oh, yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Maureen Coates. I used to be the Acting Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Installations, Environment, and Logistics, so it's very nice to see some colleagues up there. I hate to bring up the 800-pound elephant in the room, but it's always been my view that there is a direct correlation between the introduction of safe, reliable uranium supplies to energy systems and expansion of those economies and the elimination of military instability. And I think we can look at Europe, Germany, Japan, South Korea as some of the examples of that because of its supply stability, ability to be stockpiled, etc. There's actually, shall we say, a leveling influence that a well-run nuclear energy program can bring to a country and a region. We're a good example of that, and like I say, portions of Europe and great portions of Asia. Have you thought more about not just the energy issue, but the conflict resolution, stabilization aspects of uranium use around the world? And can we talk more about that, not just whether it's 1 cent or 2 cents? And then, of course, added into that is the added benefit of the elimination of not only carbon, but a whole host of harmful material that becomes fugitive waste products, as opposed to the control material that is recyclable.
I'll take it on after you.
Maureen, well, as you know, Admiral Bowman was a member of is a member of the Military Advisory Board, and can speak the most eloquently about the importance of nuclear power and the value of nuclear power in addressing the challenges of climate change. Certainly, nuclear has a place, and an important place, and perhaps even a growing role in addressing the mix of energy needed to operate in a carbon-constrained world. And you know well from your professional experiences the challenges that need to be addressed to make that more viable. But I think that growing awareness of the security risks associated with climate change will help move that debate along so that we can address those issues in a common sense manner and continue to include nuclear power responsibly in the energy mix needed to address our energy needs.
General?
Yeah. First of all, yes. I mean, I believe we should have more nuclear power. It's very costly, as you know. It's long, takes a long time to build these things. I mean, France, 80-some% of all their power is nuclear. They've got it a long time ago. But so I think first of all, the answer, if you go to the energy security side, which is where I feel a lot more comfortable, although I believe in the climate change issue, but I'm not as expert on that. To get out of this energy dependency problem, which we're never going to become, well, I shouldn't say never. Realistically, in our lifetime, we're not going to become independent. And I'm not sure we really want to become independent. I mean, the global economy necessarily wouldn't, if you think as an economist does, which is kind of hard to do, but
you have to have at least two hands.
You got to have two hands on the one hand, the other hand. But global economy-wise, it just wouldn't be smart to do that. But it would be nice to reduce our dependency in certain areas that can manipulate our foreign policy that don't have our best interest in mind. That would be a good thing. And so to do that, you have to do a bunch of things. One is CAFE, which I'm on another group called Securing America's Future Energy with 10 CEOs and 10 retired generals, and one of the big recommendations is a CAFE efficiency regulation law that's been introduced by Senator Dorgan and Senator Craig now. to increase vehicle efficiency all the way across the board, from light vehicles to heavy trucks, which is the difference and a little bit different, to 4% per year. And that would be helpful. That would be about 4.5 million barrels of oil a day for the United States. Million barrels. And then you have to do other things, alternative fuels, and I personally believe a floor for those alternative fuel development would be a good idea for a barrel of oil, $35 or something. And then you need to do supply, which the environmentalists and the supply siders sometimes have friction, but Outer Continental Shelf development, as well as ANWR, to at least look at it. The ANWR, as far as I'm concerned, is a strategic petroleum reserve. You ought to treat it as such. And then foreign policy issues. But in our report, we didn't talk about renewables. We didn't talk about nuclear. And that we're going to have to do as well. So you know, they have the terminology of silver bullet. In this case, there's a silver shotgun pellets is what we need to do to get out of it. And part of it will be nuclear. And then I'll just finish that. I think the United States has to rapidly get something going on interim storage of used fuel. And, you know, the whole Yucca Mountain thing is, you go to Nevada, it's a religion out there. But we got to do something about it. And ironically, you know, to me, it's a red herring because we already have the stuff stored at nuclear power plants anyway. So, yes, I think we're going to have to do all of it. And the real bottom line of this whole thing is going to take some serious leadership. And as Paul said, the American public isn't quite there yet. They're almost there. You know, we almost got there last summer a little bit on getting nervous about 90% of all the oil in the world being owned by national oil companies. By the way, that's why you can't have a free market approach to this thing. There's only one of the top 10 holders of petroleum reserve in the world, companies. Only one is private, and that's Exxon. They're number 9. All the rest are companies that are either in Iraq is one of them, by the way, has some, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, you name it. So, yeah, we're going to have to do all of it, and I think our government would do well to, I think, accelerate the licensing of some of the plants would help too, for the nuclear power plants.
Did your question have to do more with the international control of fissionable material and how that cycle is controlled?
No, it had more to do with recognizing that when you introduce uranium to developing economies and you have a stabilizing effect on their energy supply, you also stabilize their security threats. That's what I was really going at. I mean, I think your comments are right on target, General, in terms of using it here in the United States. What I'm trying to figure out is, how is it going to help us in China, and how is it going to help us in India, where all of the supply mechanisms and the economic turmoil that result, or even in Africa eventually, from migration and lack of energy supply, and therefore lack of ability to convert natural resources effectively, or just they're not sitting on coal resources like Russia and the United States or a la France. So how do we effectively use uranium as a conflict avoidance element in terms of stabilizing energy economy?
Well, I think you could. One of the real issue to me is affordability. That's number one. It's really, really expensive. 2 is the control of the material is important as well, and I think the NPT is going to have to be looked at a little bit, and the Nunn-Lugar thing. But you're saying that it would be nice to help underdeveloped countries have nuclear power to help them stabilize their economy, and et cetera, et cetera.
Well, a lot of them have it already. Many of these countries have it already. It's just a question of where would the world focus want to be on policy, investment choices, et cetera, in order to understand whether, I'm not suggesting that there's an either or, clean coal investment, that sort of thing, but certainly exporting this technology.
There's 3. I think Chuck's hit on the 3 issues. The number 1 is the cost of doing that. Number 2 is the cycle, the cycle of the fuel. I mean, on the front end, the fuel is very. You could have a piece of fuel sitting there on the desk, but on the back end, the fuel is highly radioactive. And third is you have to be dealing with responsible government. It won't work. And some of these governments aren't that stable.
But no, like I say, I wasn't.
Yes,
I'm talking the Chinas and the Indias and countries like that. But by the
Well,
way,
the United States has recently made an agreement with India on this, which, and China has nuclear capability. So, I mean,
I will disagree with you on one point in terms of expense, because I don't think anyone has ever run a true value consideration for what it was like to build a plant that could run for 50 or 60 years and never use the airshed for fugitive waste material management.
life cycle cost is good. Once you get it going, it's cheap. But the problem, you got to make an investment.
Well, I bought a
Pretty hard to
front-loading
start
washing
out.
machine. That cost extra.
Thank you very much. We have a question over here.
I want to commend the speakers in the report and this event. And oh yeah, Mike Farrell. I was going to get to that. Former chairman of the Environmental Law Committee of the Bar Association of D.C. That's important because in 1995 we were one of the first bar associations to hold conferences on climate change. We got a lot of heat from lawyers with industrial clients who didn't like the airing of the topic. So I got to commend the fact you've got a good turnout too. As it turned out, and this is more of an observation with some advice and maybe a question on the tail end, one of the things that I saw that was fascinating, we held climate conferences every other month for almost 5 years. And there was a tremendous amount of effort on the part of people in the science to get industry to take this seriously. And when it finally got through, and I would say especially I have wound up working more with insurance companies now. The catalytic moment was maybe Katrina. And when it finally got through, what was funny was that the science people finally got credibility, but they didn't get total control of their message, i.e., one of the things that's happened is that the insurance industry has basically decided to redline states and say there are certain areas we don't want to be in. This climate thing really is serious and it's going to kill us, and we've got to get out of here. And one of the things I'm dealing with in terms of trying to coordinate collaboration, conversation between science and insurance people is trying to get the whole message through and not have a selective sort of cherry picking about, okay, this is the part where we finally believe is okay, the rest we're going to sort of ignore you on. And I'm wondering if one of the things that might happen is that for you it's early on now trying to make this climate change and national security argument and get people to really connect the two and take it seriously. When you finally get to the point where people are going to take this seriously, and I'm thinking also in terms of the congressman's former colleagues back on the Hill, are we going to face the threat of people maybe saying, oh my God, now we have to readdress the whole question of national security. Maybe we can't be in certain regions because of climate change. And how would you be able to argue that we can't just write off countries? We can't go into eco-isolationism the way I'm seeing a form of insurance isolationism.
well,
No,
I'll just quickly say one thing. It's interesting in the comfort of this room to speculate that we will not respond to something intentionally by some kind of fiat. And one of the things that I've been involved in planning in the military, and by the way, I'm not soft-headed on this stuff. I mean, I believe in the best interest of the United States too. But the theory that we're going to selectively decide where we go never works because the pressures mount. We weren't going to go into northern Iraq and help the Kurds. Pressure mounted, we went in the next day. Darfur is a lot of pressure. Something's going to have to give there. The tsunami, we went and did it. The Pakistan earthquakes, the earthquakes in Algeria, you name it. Bosnia. I mean, there are people that say we are in the United States not going to do this anymore. We're going to just take care of our own interests and somebody else can help out because there's a big world out there. It just doesn't work that way. We'll be there and we'll do it, and if we don't, then we're a different country than I think we are. So I just think from that standpoint, from a military perspective and government perspective, we need to plan for, okay, you're probably going to get involved. What do you do about it? Now, if you do believe there's a good chance of it happening and you're going to be involved, then the best thing to do is try to avoid it in the first place, as far as I'm concerned.
General Wald speaks eloquently and from experience. General Zinni, who was also a member of the Military Advisory Board, says when he was commander of CENTCOM, he had two missions, engagement and warfighting. And the more he did engagement, the less likely he would be to have to do warfighting. So I think that answers your question.
Question right here.
Thank you. Graham Pugh from the Department of Energy. I grew up in a military family. My father was career Air Force, so I still have a lot of connections there. But one of the things that I find is that there's a military culture. It tends to be more conservative, and judging by the argument I had around the Mother's Day table yesterday about the reality of climate change with my family members, leads me to ask the question about, you're all retired. What do you think the bulk of the active duty military think about this issue, and do you think it has staying power?
I think the active duty guys think a lot about energy. You've seen requests already from the theater for renewable forms of energy for the bases over there. Military guys, above everything else they do, they're practical. If they see a problem, they address it. They don't go out seeking problems, but when they see a problem, they address it. I think most guys see that energy and the way we use energy is a major issue. The Air Force is already experimenting with alternative fuels on B-52s, to develop those kinds of things. There's a lot of research going on in the military now about alternative fuels, the renewable forms, from just an energy standpoint, which is connected to all this.
I think General Farrell's right. I do think also that this is a little bit of a generational issue. And I think my sense is that the younger people in the military, pick a number, but younger than I was, probably have a better understanding and a feel for it, or even a visceral belief in it, And I think there's been let's be frank, the issue is a bunch of military guys come out and say they got a climate change problem. Okay, well, where did that come from? First of all, are they credible, or do they just get soft-headed after retirement? Because traditionally, military people are thought of as being conservative, as you point out. And the conservative people in the country are associated with climate change as a hoax, traditionally. I think that's my generation. I think the new generation is not going to have that problem.
General, I think one of the things that's going to aid in the cause, not just this report, which is going to get wide circulation and very respected careerist, but the military, from my experience, has always avoided the political. Let the politicians argue about politics. They get concerned about policy. This is really getting out of the political arena now. This is on Main Street. Everybody's talking about it. You can't turn on television today, one channel or the other, without seeing a report. Miles O'Brien on CNN, a report on global climate change, its implications. Then you have Tom Brokaw comes out of retirement to host a 1-hour special. Al Gore wins an Academy Award from a movie. I mean, all over, people are being exposed to this. And once again, let me stress, I think the American public, by and large, is way ahead of Washington in this area. You can't go on any campus in America without seeing very active groups. And so take this report, take a couple copies, and pass them around the family.
But let me just finish. If you saw the response to the National Intelligence Estimate recommendation that Senator Hagel and Durbin, there's quite a bit of debate on the Hill on that, and there were people saying you're wasting the U.S. money doing this. So even though I think the congressman's brilliant on this and he's led the way, there are still a couple camps out there, and generally, and maybe it is just Washington, but I don't think so. I mean, if you go to the Midwest, there are people that think that people that talk about this are crazy. So
everything he said wasn't true.
Anyway, I think it'll get better as time goes by.
Major.
Hi, Shannon Beebe, Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army. sort of to address this a little bit as far as the younger generation. I can't speak for all the younger generation, but I think what the difference that we're seeing is how we view the security paradigm. In the past, it's been very much a state-on-state, dealing with state engagements, those kinds of things. Now what we're starting to see is more of a human security paradigm that issues transcend borders, which battle carrier group do you send to knock out the tsunami? Which brigade striker team do you send to cure malaria? Those kinds of things. I would like to turn the question almost back a little bit to what Jeff DeBelco asked. With the Africa Command standing up, not only these challenges of climate change present perhaps a crisis, but also an opportunity for the engagement, the environmental security engagements, positive types of engagements with the Chinese, positive types of engagements to show military under civilian rule, those kinds of things. What would your recommendations be to Africa Command specifically on how to formulate that environmental security policy, and what would the priority be in relation to the rest of the missions and the mission sets that they're going to have to perform on the continent?
I would start with stability as the mission. And I would start with, it isn't just, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just a military issue. So you have to have an environment to develop an economy. You have to have good government. That's a difficult problem. A lot of the governments in Africa have quite a bit of military influence in their governments, more than we do, certainly. And like the Congressman said, we theoretically are supposed to be, apolitical in the military, and you are. But I would work on having one of the problems with Africa is it's so big and mostly misunderstood and complex. And as much time as I spent there, I have no clue about it, although I think I know something. And people that have spent a lot of their time in their lives down there can talk to this better. But very, very complex, and yet kind of associated in a lot of ways. The African Union right now had an unlucky thing with the Darfur. As they stood up, they've got a major problem, so they've been distracted with that. I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just it's a lot of effort. But I think the African Union would be the thing that we'd want to work with the most, to try to get some regional approach to these things through the regional economic communities, have them start building up the capacity to be more dependent upon each other, work on governance and standards and accountability, work on the capacity for their governments to take care of at least their own security to a certain extent. And then it's going to take a lot of non-military effort. One of the best program we have in the United States military of foreign aid is a thing that's called International Military Education Training, IMET. And Colin Powell said if he had $1 more to spend on anything that he had in government, it would be on IMET. And what happens is they take military people from other countries, bring them to the United States, and this has been controversy with some South American issues, but generally speaking, it really works good in professional military education. And they go back, usually officers, but also enlisted, and they're most of the time changed people. They spend a year in America, and all of a sudden they see a different world in most cases. And it sounds almost unbelievable, but in the case of Georgia, when they had the revolution a couple of years ago, the senior military person there had been trained in America, and he refused to bring the military out to counter the civilian revolution. To me, that's what we ought to be doing. And I mean, there's reality. You're going to have some problems where it defaults back to a traditional military response. But generally speaking, that's what I would do. And by the way, it's not a U.S. issue only. It's an international, global issue, and there's a lot of NGOs involved as well. So,
thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank all the panelists here tonight. Let me call to your attention the preamble to the report, the message to the reader. It says, global change presents significant national security challenges for the United States. The increasing risk from climate change should be addressed now because they almost certainly will get worse if we delay. Generals, Ms. Goodman, Mr. Thomas, thank you so very much, and thank you for your service.
Thank you very
I refer you to the